Hello, welcome everyone. This is our one and only conversation about Lord Byron, who is beyond awesome and whose awesomeness is so unfathomable that we are flailing all the way to the end. And just look at this. The man died at 36, and this is the collected works of Lord Byron. It's a heavy, hefty tome, and this is actually the edition from which I was gathering much of my wisdom about the countless references. You're sort of sensing that there are some cantos in Byron where you have to have a footnote to each word, and some of those words have to have footnotes to footnotes. The way his mind worked is incomprehensible. He had sort of an encyclopedic computer brain, and he could put all of his knowledge into every single canto and make it rhyme, which is stunning. And it's funny that I said that he almost had a computerized encyclopedic brain, because remember my comment from way back when in May about his daughter Ada Byron, who worked with the person who was considered the first computer programmer in history, Babbage, and they worked on his calculations. And so Ada, who was not allowed to read her father's poetry because the relationship between mom and dad was catastrophic, eventually became a math genius, a proto-computer programmer, and eventually she did read her father's poetry. Sadly, she also died at 36, and in her will, she asked to be buried next to her father, and they are buried next to each other. So that is the interesting connection of Byron and his descendant to mathematics. But Byron's brain is, it works in such mysterious ways that those of you who were occasionally reading through incomprehensible stanzas of poetry and saying, what is he saying? And why is there so much information in each stanza? That's the way his mind works. And we are incredibly privileged to have this heritage of the thick tome. So we got through all of Childe Harold, which was delightful, and I loved reading your commentary, even though I wasn't commenting on commentary much. But when we started with Childe Harold, we were first reading the works of a very young man who is commenting on how he sees the world and how he's coming to terms with the world and how he is processing a reality that is all new to him. He is off to see Europe. He's on his grand tour, a very strange grand tour, considering that he was traveling through Europe during the first trip he took to Europe was during the Napoleonic Wars. It's one of those strange facts. Byron has never been to Paris. It's incomprehensible to us to think that Paris, that was so quintessential to the philosophical, political, geopolitical, economic changes, military changes that were happening in Europe during Byron's period. He never visited Paris because it was such a complicated place at the time of his travels. And it's fascinating. One of his last names was Noel because he received that title, that name, from his mother's family, who was Scottish. And so he was thrilled about the fact that his name, N.B., George Noel Byron, was the same as Bonaparte's name, Napoleon Bonaparte, N.B. So Byron had this intrinsic internalization of all things Byron, of all things Napoleon. Just like most writers of that time period, Napoleon was larger than life, and it's fascinating. Byron died just 3 years after Napoleon's death. Napoleon died in 21 on St. Helena, and Byron is commenting in his later poetic works on the death of Napoleon and the legacy of Napoleon. So we start Childe Harold, this young man who cannot visit Central Europe because of the Napoleonic Wars. And he's sort of going along the outskirts. And did you also notice that our Don Juan, or Don Juan, is traveling the route of Napoleon's first journey through Europe? It's the same geography. He doesn't cross the Channel, right? He doesn't go to England till at the very end. But it's fascinating that his commentary on seeing the white cliffs of Dover are reminiscent to us, sophisticated readers, of Byron's persona in Childe Harold, contemplating the white cliffs of Dover as he's leaving. And then, of course, it's Portugal and Spain. And so Byron and Don Juan and Childe Harold travel from Spain through the Mediterranean to Greece. And that is the quintessence of Byron's spirit. His calling to go back to Greece, to take all of his characters back to Greece, is where his life's journey eventually ends. And it's devastating to read the final cantos of Don Juan, precisely because you know that everything will be cut short. We will never know how the epic would have ended, because it ends in Missolonghi on the 19th of April, 1824, when Byron dies, and becomes a beacon of European call for the liberation of Greece. To say that European intellectuals who were calling for the liberation of Greece were shocked when Byron died while pursuing this goal was an understatement. It became all of a sudden such a public pronouncement that the liberation of Greece was completed very shortly after Byron's death, and Greece was one of the first countries that was liberated from Ottoman rule. And for me personally, this was quite a journey of discovery, because I've always wanted to see the Balkans. There was just something so incredibly complex and inexplicable and mesmerizing about the Balkans. And as you can tell from that one post that I managed to make, I did visit the places that Byron visited during his travels. I did go to Tepelene, Albania, and I found the castle where Byron met Ali Pasha. And I saw the view that Byron was looking at that inspired him to start writing Childe Harold, which I still can't process. It's just one of those things for a literature person. And I'm going to just do one shout out to the Barbie movie here. I've seen it, and I am giving myself the title, The Irrepressible Thoughts of Literature Barbie. So those of you who have seen the movie will understand the reference. So this Irrepressible Thoughts of Literature Barbie was completely blown away by just the sheer magnificence of what Byron saw there. And it's fascinating how he's coming to terms with who he is in all of his works. And this journey of self-discovery through poetry is something that is incredibly challenging for us as readers, because we are taken on a very personal journey through Byron's self-realization, but at the same time, incredibly rewarding to see how this brilliance self-realizes in verse. It doesn't happen very often. And so with Byron, the young man leaving England, traveling through Portugal and Spain and the Mediterranean and Greece, and Albania, of course, which was much, much larger at the time of Byron's travels. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and the larger Albania had its capital in a city that is now in northern Greece, Ioannina, and I visited that city too. And it was just astonishing to be in northern Greece and visit a castle that still has all of the minarets and mosques of the Ottoman period of this part of northern Greece. And then he goes back to England and he finds himself incredibly famous. His poetry spoke to a generation. This journey of self-discovery that he and his character were going through seemed to have struck a chord as a self-discovery for an entire generation of young people who were trying to come to terms with nothing less than modernity. The world has entered a world where kings were deposed, where liberty became a thing that was possible to achieve in a lifetime. It's fascinating to what extent Byron is fascinated by the American Revolution. He has such positive things to say about George Washington. For him, George Washington was this person who brought liberty into fruition in the here and now, and rejected the title of king. He did not descend into the same rut as as the power that used to rule the American colonies. But Byron is also incredibly anti-slavery. He has nothing but derision for the expansion of the British Empire, and how he talks about the fact that the American experiment, this push for liberty that was brought into reality by the efforts of people like George Washington, succeeded there, but did not succeed in Europe. And so as Byron gets older, during his second trip to the continent and his final trip to the continent, he will never return to England. We see a break. There's a different Byron in cantos 3 and 4 of Childe Harold, a much more introspective Byron, a darker Byron, a broody Byron, a moody Byron, and a Byron who is saying, look at England. It keeps saying to Europe that it has liberated Europe from this dictator, Napoleon. And he's just brutalizing Wellington all the time. And of course, Wellington was the English commander who won against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. Imagine visiting the battlefield of Waterloo 11 months after the battle. That is Byron's experience. And so he keeps saying that this England that wants to convince Europe that Europe has been liberated through England's efforts from the brutal dictatorship of Napoleon, but Europe is not free. Europe is less free now than it was when it was brutalized by Napoleon. And so this is very much, though, Byron's view that something essential to self-realization was lost in this decapitation of the ideas of the French Revolution. So very complex politically, very complex geopolitically. It's not just Byron who is this young man who is self-realizing his inner thoughts. It's a mature, thoughtful human being who is looking at the geopolitics of Europe and the world from a distance, but also from incredible knowledge and incredible perceptive understanding. And his attacks on Wellington continue all the way to the end of Don Juan, and especially at the very end, in the last 7 cantos, when he sends his character to England to be his judge of a culture, a society, the aristocracy, the establishment that was so critical of Byron. I find it absolutely deliciously wicked. He sends his poetic persona, this young man who has loved and suffered and traveled and went through all of these adventures. And those of you who read the Count of Monte Cristo with me, isn't that astounding to what extent Alexander Dumas just is incorporating so many aspects of the Byronic journey into his novel, to the point where one of his characters is called Haidé. And she's Greek, and she is, and also notice that Haidé in Byron has a North African mother and a Greek father. In the Count of Monte Cristo, it's the opposite. Haidé has Ali Pasha of Tepelen, the man whose castle I visited, is the father of this character in the Count of Monte Cristo, and then her mother Vasiliki is an Eastern Christian. So Byron's vision of this journey that has personal and political implications will be essential to writers who come after him, like Alexander Dumas. And also so many Russian writers. I'm this close to considering perhaps reading Pushkin's Eugene Onegin and Lermontov's The Hero of Our Time next spring, precisely because that will be, we would be doing it for literally the 200th anniversary of Byron's death in April, because the joke about Pushkin's Eugene Onegin was he was a Muscovite in Harold's cloak. That is the English translation. So he takes this very Russian hero, Eugene Onegin, and makes him as Byronic as is possible in the Russian context of the early 19th century. And then with Lermontov's Hero of Our Time, in certain parts of the novel, characters start limping not once, not twice, not three times, but four times. And it's his almost visceral calling out towards Byron, because Byron had the quintessential Byronic limp because of his club foot. But also Lermontov was known as the student, the young person who was always sulking and walking around with a tome of Byron under his arm. So all of these writers internalized Byron because he was so seductive, but also so incredibly revealing of this moment in European history, the moment of the collapse of the ideals of the French Revolution, the return of reaction, the return of monarchic governments instead of republican or governments that promoted republics. The only republic that remained was the American experiment. And at the time of Byron's life, it was still not resolved. There was no certainty that it will succeed because it was so torn by its own internal contradictions. And of course, what Byron was seeing in England was an expansion of the empire. It's as if the defeat of Napoleon freed the English empire to the British Empire to expand around the world, because the great opposition to it, France, which also competed with England over access to empire territory, was eliminated so completely. It's also fascinating that these two countries that have been at war with each other since the time of William the Conqueror, all of a sudden will team up in the Crimean War later on in the mid-19th century. It will be the French and the English who will be united. It's fascinating also that the French and English will be on each other's side, consequently, both in World War I and World War II. So the ramification of what happened to France and its relationship with England is still, we are still living in that world. And Byron's very astute assessment of this relationship is just, it floors me to what extent his perception was so wise. So yes, he brutalizes the British Empire, and he says that in England you hear all of this talk of liberty, and yet they are still a country that owns slaves. It's fascinating that slave trade was abolished in England in the early 19th century, but not owning slaves. And we also deal with a world where human beings are enslaved everywhere in Europe, which is so shocking to us. I mean, here we are in the early 19th century, and we are post all of the Napoleonic Wars, post 1815. That's the Battle of Waterloo. And then Byron keeps bringing up the issue of slavery because England is still a slave-owning country. The United States still trades in slaves, but also France is a slave-owning country. France still has slaves in the Caribbean, and also the Ottoman Empire is a slave-owning country. So Don Juan being sold into Ottoman slavery was a huge issue in Europe till World War I. Because Turkey did not formally abolish slavery till the 20th century. So Byron is a fighter for individual human freedom through and through. He is a fighter for countries that are oppressed, such as Greece and Italy. And remember, the love of his life, Countess Teresa, her family was involved in fighting against Austrian rule in northern Italy. And Byron was helping them, both financially and by delivering weapons. In so many ways, getting shipped off to Greece was a relief to the Austrian authorities because they sort of felt like, well, let him fight the Turks. I mean, we are rid of him. He's so inconvenient for everyone. This Byronic ability to speak truth to power was threatening to so many empires. He criticized his own empire, the British Empire. He criticized the Austrian Empire, and he put his money where his mouth was when he was living in Italy. And then, of course, he financed a part of Greece's independence movement against Ottoman Turkey. So Byron was so inconvenient. And so here we come to his constant sniping against the poet Southey, who was the poet laureate of his time. And at some point, you just feel, at first, you sort of feel like, well, yes, Byron, you are not the poet laureate. Southey is. So perhaps you are just a little too annoyed by this fact. But then you realize, no, he really means it. He can't stand the fact that Southey, who was an excellent poet, is all of a sudden writing all of this poetry glorifying the aristocratic patrons who are financing his poetic career. And Byron is not willing to stoop to that. He knows that his poetry was extremely popular. I mean, he could make a living from publishing things like the Giaour or the Corsair. Remember all of those fun, shortish, longish poems that he writes right after publishing Childe Harold? Those were incredibly popular, and he could make a living publishing that stuff. But Byron is deeper than that. Byron is deeper than the swashbuckling adventure, even though he invented. Do you remember how excited I was to realize, oh my God, the swashbuckling piratical heroes that we are still so fond of today, descendants of the Byronic character that was created in a poem like the Corsair. And we have pirates in pretty much all along poetical works of Byron. There are pirates in Childe Harold, there are pirates in Don Juan. And piracy in the Mediterranean was a thing. There were still pirates at the times of Byron in the Mediterranean Sea. It wasn't something that was happening in the Caribbean. And so Byron is just sniping at all of these poets. With Wordsworth, it's more complicated because Wordsworth will not become poet laureate until after Byron's death. And Southey will live for a long time, so he will be the poet laureate for many, many years after Byron's death. And then, of course, it will be Wordsworth. But it seems like Byron sort of felt like, oh my gosh, if Wordsworth continues on this trajectory, he too will become a poet laureate, and he's going to ruin his poetical career by being an official poet. But with Southey, he just feels that there's something cheapening of the high calling of poetry to be an official poet, to write poetry that is approved of by the authorities. So Byron just remains this rebel, just this person who shakes his fist continuously at all powers, at non-democratic powers, at royalist powers, at powers that speak of liberation and freedom, and yet enslave entire nations, entire peoples in their under their colonial rule, and intellectuals who become complicit with this kind of imperialism. And Byron just lives his life according to his calling of the heart all the way to the end. And that's why he is still so revered in Greece. April 19th is considered to be a national day of commemoration of Byron. It's fascinating. When I was in Cyprus, I spoke to a woman, and she was just interested in what I've seen and my impressions. I've never been to Cyprus before. And I said that I'm fascinated about the relationship between Greece and the Greek world and the Turkish world, the Ottoman world, precisely because in Cyprus, this relationship has not been resolved. To this day, 1/3 of Cyprus is occupied by Turkey since the 1970s. It was reoccupied by Turkey after the British left. So it was a British colonial possession in most of 20th century. And when the English left, the Turks came back and took the northern part of Cyprus. And 1/3 of it is in Turkish hands today. And the capital, Nicosia, is a divided capital in Europe. Berlin used to be a divided capital in Europe. That's no longer the case, but Nicosia still is. And so I told her that what made me fascinated by this whole incredible, complex, just mind-bogglingly beautiful world is Byron. And she immediately said, Lord Byron. And she was so excited. She's Greek. And for her to meet someone who doesn't speak Greek, who's not a native speaker of English, who is absolutely psyched about Byron to the point of just going to visit these places. you could just see how incredibly thrilled she was. And she said, yes, he's essential to us. And his struggle for Greek liberation is still remembered today. We still name boys after him. And so it's incredible to what extent this legacy of going against the prevailing geopolitical opinion still resonates in Greece today, because he was so instrumental in making the ideological case and international case for Greece's liberation from Ottoman Turkey. And remember, Greece was under Turkish rule for 400 years. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Same was most of the Balkans. I was in Bulgaria too, and I was stunned to find out that the Turks did not leave till 1908, and then the Balkan War started in 1910. And so we think that 1914 is the day of the beginning of World War I, but in the Balkans, that war was raging for 4 years before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. I saw that bridge. It is a nothing bridge over a tiny river. And we assumed that that's when it began, but it was in so many ways a war that was still fought over what is the Balkans, who is in charge, what constitutes a national border in the Balkans. And Greece is not officially considered a part of the Balkans, but the entirety of what is above Greece, what separates Greece from the European continent, is the Balkans. And that is the area that fascinated Byron so much. It's amazing to go to these places and see it through the prism of Byron's understanding of this area and his sort of visceral sense that this is so important. and so we are the lucky recipients of this legacy of Byron's understanding of what Greece means for the world, what Greece means for Europe, and what Greece meant personally for him. And another European writer who was enamored of the Greek heritage was, of course, Goethe. And Byron dedicated some of his poems to Goethe. Do you remember when we were reading things like the Two Foscari and Cain? We read Manfred. That was my comment on Manfred was so endless, because I listened to it twice, and then I looked at the poem, and this is just, it's unembraceable. It is larger than we can ever imagine. Byron's Manfred is so complex. And remember, I posted a couple of days an illustration of Byron's Manfred where he is standing on the top of Jungfrau and just ready to leap with his hands on his head. That is sort of the human condition, right? There's that other painting of a man standing over a precipice. It's the David Caspar Friedrich painting, where this human being is in control and he's in charge of the elements, and he's contemplating all the elements. And for me, that is just a bit too controlled. For me, Manfred over Jungfrau is much more of a comment of the human condition. It's like this, we are on the edge of the precipice. So that edge of the precipice sense of humanity was so brilliantly captured by Byron. And yeah, so he dedicates a bunch of his stuff to Goethe. He is enamored of Goethe. He's in love what Goethe represents for European intellectuals. And Goethe traveled to Italy. His admiration for Italy is tremendous, but also he's filled with admiration for the Greek heritage of Europe. And when Goethe found out that Byron died, he was shocked. He was much older than Byron, and he was writing volume 2 of Faust. And in volume 2 of Faust, I'm not going to tell you the names of the characters, but 2 characters have a baby, and that baby is inspired by Byron. That character is sort of the merger of the ancient Greek heritage of Europe and this romantic Germanic imagination that is so quintessential in both the poetic works of Byron and Goethe. So there's a character in volume 2 of Faust that is dedicated to Byron, that is based on Byron, that is the embodiment of Byron's spirit that has gone. And he doesn't finish his greatest work. 17,000 lines is just not enough. It's funny how, do you remember when he was just sort of fooling around and asking himself, well, how long should this be? Should it be 12 books? 12 books is enough. I mean, 12 books is totally sufficient. It's respectable. And remember, I reminded you that Virgil and his Aeneid is 12 books long because Virgil felt that the Odyssey and the Iliad 24 books each, and you cannot surpass the glory of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So since he is a Roman poet and Roman culture is a copy and then homage to Greek culture, his Aeneid is going to be only 12 books. And then fast forward to Milton, who is Byron's English predecessor. He first publishes Paradise Lost in 10 books, and then he feels that, no, if I'm going to like insert myself in the tradition of the epic, it has to be 12 books. My Paradise Lost is going to be as long as Virgil's Aeneid because it's half the size of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that's very fitting because nothing can be as spectacular as the Greek world. And so Byron feels that, well, you know, if I'm going to insert myself into this epic tradition, 12 books is quite respectable. But then he keeps writing and writing and writing. And at one point he says, well, maybe 24 would be just fine. So it's so amazing. He's just, you know, Virgil and Milton were more modest than me. I don't mind writing a 24-book epic. It will be just as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And sadly, it's 16 and a half. And 16 and a half is all we've got. I know exactly the poem that I'm going to post when we get to the end of 17. Byron wrote about, there's this almost like uncanny anticipation of his own death. It's as if he wasn't really courting it, but he knew that going into a war zone is fraught with consequences. And so he writes this poem about the possibility of dying, and it's the last finished poem of Byron from 1824. So I'm going to post that without any commentary when we get to the end of book 17 of Don Juan. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. I mean, just about my favorite thing that he writes about in all of his works is his visit to the battlefield of Waterloo. That's honest. Like you can't even imagine how amazing that is. And he knows that this battlefield is a turning point in history. And he's there 11 months after the battle was fought. It was a June battle in 1815, and he is there in May of 1816. And so he will inspire, Byron's description of the battlefield of Waterloo will inspire Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. One of his characters will be participating in the Battle of Waterloo, and Hugo will actually finish writing Les Miserables on the battlefield. The last sentences of the novel will be written there. So Victor Hugo understands the significance of this one battle, and he will be writing this book. I mean, it will be published in 1862, so much later than Byron's work. And then Stendhal will also write about who's Julian Sorel in The Red and the Black is such a quintessential Byronic character. His love affair was an older woman, his adventures, his internal contradictions, his internal monologues are so Byronic. And in his Charterhouse of Parma, he will take another slightly Byronic character, a young man who is attempting to self-realize. Yes, Fabrizio del Dongo is a very Byronic character. He will feel that it's important for a young man of that time period to be placed on the battlefield of Waterloo because it's such a quintessential moment of European history and world history. So that's me on Byron. I love him. I've loved him since I was a teenager. He's impossible to read, though. He is impossible to read. but he's impossible not to love. The two writers that were absolutely crucial to Anna Barker becoming Anna Barker, the irrepressible thoughts of literature Barbie, were Stendhal and his Red and Black, and we read it a little while back, about 15 months ago. It's once again, it's seemingly such a novel. Like, what happens there? Who is this character? But Julian Sorel inspired so many novels, so many characters, because that book was so early in the 19th century. It was an 1830 book. And then, of course, Byron, who inspired Stendhal and Hugo and Dumas and all of those writers we were reading last year. So looking back at those writers through the prism of Byron makes them so much more understandable, so much more relatable. We know where they come from. And then reading all of 19th century Russian literature, I mean, characters like Andrei Bolkonsky, there's so much Byronism in him. And Dostoevsky will have fun with Byronism. He will subvert it. He will have characters who will be positing these big Byronic questions, and Dostoevsky will make minced meat out of them. So because his psychological astuteness is just so devastating, and he loves to brutalize his characters so much. But he read Byron, he understands Byron, and it's amazing to what extent his earlier works have characters that are very idealistic and very Byronic. So even someone as psychologically, realistically astute as Dostoevsky will go through his I have to create a Byronic character in order to destroy the Byronic character in me, in order to become a writer who is not Byron. And it's fascinating to look at Dostoevsky through the prism of all of the writers he destroys in his writing, one book at a time, until in Brothers Karamazov. It's all the writers. It's just you steal from absolutely everyone. You toss everything into this one novel that is so you that it is unmistakable genius. And Byron does that in his works. He throws all of world literature. I've never encountered a writer who so unabashedly throws the entirety of world history, the entirety of world literature, every writer. And he does it over and over and over again into one work. And then he says, well, I'm one of them, but I'm me. and it's almost this toddlerish desire to prove yourself that is then taken into this teenage self-realization, and then into gray-haired affirmation of what it means to be an individual like Byron. I mean, like all of that commentary about reaching my middle years and standing in the dark wood of my life, all of those references to the Divine Comedy of Dante. And I love it when Don Juan is in Istanbul in the harem, and one of the young ladies is telling about her dream, and her dream is, I mean, she has never read Milton and she has never read Dante, but it is Byron who's speaking through her. So her narrative of her own dream is so Miltonic and so paradise, not paradise, but Divine Comedy infused. And so Byron comes to the realization that he is standing like Dante in the dark wood of his middle years, and there's introspection now there. There's solidity. There's some kind of, I need to know who I am. But he never reaches the wisdom of his 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, like Tolstoy, who died at 82. And he's gone. And there's that moment of, how could this happen? Why is he gone? And we will have that sense when we get to the end of Don Juan, and that's what I'm dreading. I'm completely honest with you. On the one hand, there are all of those references to all of those English people. So what shocks me about the period of Regency, when George IV was too young to be king, and he's not Prince of Wales anymore, but the Regency period is like how incredibly immoral everyone was, and how many illegitimate children all of these English aristocratic women had. It's stunning. And so Byron's mockery of this beacon of humanity as a cesspool of immorality is so hilarious because he's so critical of his own roots. He contributed to that immorality in a stunning way. He had so many love affairs in his life. Remember, I told you that I read that I don't remember the title of the book now, but the first sentence of the Love Lives of Lord Byron, I believe it's called. And the first sentence of the introduction says, whether the book would be entitled the Life of Lord Byron or the Love Life of Lord Byron would make no difference to history, because the love life of Byron is his life. It is a continuous story of Byron's affairs, and he creates a character who's very similar to that. But what is so charming about Don Juan is, instead of Don Juan going after women, it's women who go after him all the time, which is reflective of the time period in Byron's life when he finished Childe Harold and he came back to England. He finished Canto 1 and 2 of Childe Harold, came back to England, and literally woke up to find himself famous. I think that's about all I had to say. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you, my dear audience members. So we will get to the end. We have 6 cantos to go. I will finish commenting on them. We're not leaving England at this point. Just a little disclaimer. It would be fun to muse about how this book could have ended. And in so many ways, it is the new Odyssey, right? It is a 19th century Odyssey of a young man who travels through a 19th century world. He's the modern day Odysseus. Very different from Odysseus, because Odysseus was a fully formed human being, mature man when he leaves for the Trojan War. And when he comes back 20 years later to Ithaca, he's the same human being. He hasn't changed much. He's still the wily Odysseus. He's still the person who shakes his fist at one-eyed giants, regardless of consequences. Maybe a little more stable, perhaps. Don Juan is a young man. He is a teenager when we begin the book. He's barely in his 20s when we reach England. Who knows? Perhaps he would go back to his Ithaca to southern Spain. Perhaps at the end of book 24, he would come back and meet his little brother. Oh my goodness. His mom sends him off because his love affair is devastating to the morality of the family, but she has a love affair and marries second time with a little baby that she presents Don Juan with. I love it when they are in St. Petersburg, when he's in St. Petersburg in the court of Catherine the Great. All of a sudden, all of his Spanish relatives start arriving because, you can brave St. Petersburg cold for a cushy position at court. It's almost as warm, they say, as southern Spain, if you're basking in the glory of incredible wealth and power. So any questions? Yes, go ahead, Jan.
Can you hear me? Do I need to push something?
No.
You can hear me?
Hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, you've often commented on the humor, and I noticed the names that he gives people reminded me of Dr. Seuss.
Yes, yes.
They're very, very funny.
Yes, yes. Vicious, like absolutely vicious. If Dr. Seuss is, funny but tame, Byron is not tame.
No.
I mean, the names that he gives to people are sometimes very sexualized, especially if they are not in English. Like all of those buffoons that he creates, the Italian buffoons that he creates, all of them have names that have something to do with sex. And then he's vicious towards English ladies because they have one thing on their mind, and they seem to be so measured and so prim and so proper, and yet he knows their backgrounds. And so the I don't remember the character's name now, but the one who wants to arrange the Don Juan's ward's education, the character that she's based on, that's what I'm supposed to be writing about the past 2 weeks. She was the mistress of the Prince of Wales. But now she's a woman of decorum. And then later on, she became the mother-in-law of Lady Caroline Lamb, who was Byron's mistress, who said that he's mad, bad, and dangerous to know. So it's fascinating how Byron is inserting his views of his, like, well, she's not his mother-in-law, right? She is the mother of his most significant English lover, but then he brings in her characteristics into the persona of the character who is going to be educating the ward of Don Juan, which is so funny because they feel that this young Muslim child obviously needs to be educated, but their moral dubiousness is so in your face that poor Layla would have been better off not being educated by these women. But of course, they feel responsible for her because, how would a young man know how to educate a small child? So all of that humor, all of that wickedness is just nonstop in Byron. And I love the fact that he finally sends his character back to England. And this is where he is just unleashed on the English. He has no more patience with them. And I also love the fact that at one point he discovers his Scottishness. He just sort of feels like, I really can't stand these imperialist pigs that I'm descended from. But guess what? I have a little bit of Scottish in me. My mom was Scottish. I spent my childhood in Scotland. I love Auld Lang Syne, and I love Walter Scott. So there's that whole like, oh my God, I am okay. There's Scottishness in me. I am not as vile as Wellington and Southey. After all, I have the same roots as Sir Walter Scott. So, dodged a bullet there. I'm, there's something redeemable about my Englishness. I'm half Scottish.
Great.
Yeah, wicked. And the Ottawa Rima, the rhyming style that he chose for Dante, just sort of invites this. It's like boom, 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 and then the last two lines delivered a punchline. And there are times when I'm like laughing out loud because you expect it. And the change of rhyming in the seventh and eighth line, the change of rhyme is conducive to that kind of, I set up the joke and then the joke is delivered. And the way he can sustain it, and of course, Dante is his hero because Dante creates the terza rima, the three rhyming lines for his Divine Comedy, which consists of three parts. Dante lived a long, beautiful life. He fully self-realized. He finished his Divine Comedy, and Byron probably could have walked past Dante's grave daily when he was living in Ravenna. I visited Dante's grave for one reason only, because Byron has seen it. So yes, it's right in the center of Ravenna, and it's about 5-minute walk from the house where he lived, where Byron lived when he was living in Ravenna. And so he sustains the same rhyming scheme for 17,000 lines, and the precedent for that was set by Dante, who sustains the same rhyming scheme for all three books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Any other questions? Need to finish those 6 books. We need to finish those 6 books, but I might as well just, I'll take photos of all of the notes for those 6 books from here, and I'm just going to post them online. You read them. You make your own conclusions. Yes, Maureen.
Okay, first I have to unmute myself. No, I was actually just clapping because, this journey with you has been absolutely incredible. So thank you. And I know we have more to go. And then it's Anna Karenina.
I showed John Canyon. I have Grumpy Tolstoy on my desk already. Yeah, there he is. Not yet.
Not yet, but thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. And in a spirit of full disclosure, I've never taught Byron in my entire life. So thank you for coming on this journey with me. He is like a thing from my teens that has always been there. And I've just been so incredibly fascinated by him as a human being, as as a literary character. I mean, he turns himself into a literary character. He becomes the persona of all of his literary heroes. And so to share my passion from my teens of all things Byron with readers who actually finished reading the most unread long poem in the Western tradition. Nobody reads these things anymore. No, but nobody does. And I loved reading your comments where you were, especially when we got into books 3 and 4 of Childe Harold. You saw the snap, you know, you saw the break. You saw Byron of book 1 and 2, and then all of a sudden you saw Byron of 3 and 4, and you could experience the growth of the poet's mind. That's what Byron savages Wordsworth about, because his Prelude is, you know, the other unreadable book, but it is taught so much more often in English departments. Like I took a class on English Romanticism, and I read, you know, the big 5, right? So you read Blake, you read Wordsworth and Coleridge, the Lake Poets, you read a little bit of Southey, and then you read Keats and Shelley. So those are the big 5. And Byron is just, he's almost an afterthought in an English Romanticism course. I did not read Byron in my college English Romanticism course, which I found baffling. And so all of his references to Coleridge and Wordsworth, do you remember I told you that I am howling from laughter? And I was like messaging a former student of mine who is going to become an English professor, who just sort of is baffled by how delighted I am by Byron savaging Wordsworth. And he keeps asking me, Anna, what happened between you and Wordsworth during your English literature course on Romanticism? And I'm like, he is boring. He has absolutely no fun. He is so self-important. And so he even titles his great big epic poem Prelude on the growth of the poet's mind. How self-important is that? And so Byron, of course, does this growth of the poet's mind. We see him mature in the course of Childe Harold, and then we see him become a naughty little boy all over Don Juan. You know, we go from everywhere from Byron being 3 to Byron being 103 in Don Juan. We have the incredible depth of introspection. We have the incredible understanding of all of world history and all of the Western literary tradition and the current moment that he's writing about. It's everything. And at the same time, he's still being 3 and just having naughty fun. And so it's delightful to be in the presence of someone who can be brilliant and self-deprecating at the same time, who can be vicious and funny at the same time. His complexity is our greatest reward for reading Byron. Things are not just one way or the other. They are everything all the time. And so that's what I said at the very beginning of my talk when I talked about his encyclopedic computer-like mind. Everything is connected. Do you remember how often in all of my comments on like the French authors that we read and on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, where I often say everything is connected. And with Byron, it's like, yes, everything is connected. You don't even have to point it out. Every canto, every stanza, everything is connected. It's delightful. It's humbling and rewarding at the same time. And that's all I have to say. And I'd better write about those last 6 cantos. As pathetic as my musings are going to be, the last comment is going to be that one poem. And at the end, I'll just say no comment. And would love to visit Missolonghi someday and just, fall on my knees, worship the Holy Grail, and just say my own personal goodbye to a voice that said plenty in his 36 years. Most of us don't have that much, attends that much in 3 times the lifetime. So thank you, Byron. Thank you, Iowa City of Literature, for giving us this platform to talk about things that nobody's talking about. And this next week, Anna Karenina, here's my copy. I've taught this one before. It's not like Byron. This one I have like lots and lots of words circled all over. As a matter of fact, my copy is falling apart at this point. It's like I'll have to like tape it together, glue it together, whatever, because this will fall apart in the course of this fall. And then sometime in October, we'll come up with reading for the next year. And I have some ideas. I'll just give you the heads up. You are the first one to hear this. Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther is going to be 250 next year. It's the most book in the Western tradition, and we just have to read it sometime. So we will start with the Sorrows of Young Werther of Goethe next year. He wrote it in March, so we'll read it in March, and we'll be going with Werther. And there's of course an opera based on that. So we'll listen to some opera. We'll read a very short work by Goethe. And then I'm seriously thinking in April of offering Eugene Onegin and The Hero of Our Time as the two greatest homages to Byron in the Russian literary tradition, because that's the 200th anniversary month of his death, and his legacy has a tremendous afterlife in so many literatures, and in Russian literature in particular. And so we might just do those two, and then we'll see what we're doing after that. So it's still sunny outside. I'm off to enjoy the wild outdoors. Thank you so much for reading. We will get those comments on the 6 cantos, and I can't thank you enough that you indulged my teenage passion in Lord Byron. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.